Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Trike. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite Number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. My hometown is League City, Texas. Our dad built a weird little two-room shack outside of its town's limits, right next to my aunt and uncle's house and just down the road from my grandparents. We didn't know if we would wind up in Texas City or Dickinson. Eventually, League City gobbled up the land around us. The two-room shack kept growing and growing despite my dad's lack of a plan. Just build, it should work. In town was a grocery store, a bank, 2 gas stations, and the post office. Right across from the post office, there was a vacant lot. Only the poured cement steps were there, surrounded by old trees. My mom said people would rent the house that used to be there. Some would stay almost the entire month. Others would only last one night. Many of the renters would be out of the door and gone in the middle of the night. No one wanted to talk about why they didn't want to stay in the house. It didn't take long for the stories to begin. Some said the original owner had committed suicide in the house. Others said there'd been several murders. Late one night, the house caught fire. It burned to the ground with only the front steps to show where the house had been. The owner of the property never rebuilt. For years, for as long as I could remember, there was that vacant lot across the street from the post office. A friend of mine lived out by the airport. I believe the airport was on 646 heading to Baycliff. Just a runway and a few hangars. Folks would skydive from there. At the far end of the field were 3 houses. All of them were one story with a brick exterior. They sat right next to each other. It looked kind of odd to see just 3 houses on the side of the road out in a field. Bob told me he was moving. Not because the house was too expensive or not a nice place. No, he said the place was haunted. He said it wasn't spooky or unnerving. It was just annoying. If anybody went into the bathroom, the door would swing open, even if they secured the door and locked it. As soon as they got set down, the door would swing wide open. Anything set on a counter in the kitchen would disappear. If you set a glass of tea on the counter and turned around to get something out of the fridge or put the jar back in there, the glass would be gone. Sometimes you would find it back in the fridge. Other times it might be in one of the cabinets or even under the sink. Everything in the house was subject to being moved, which led the family to having to look for their possessions. Keys, wallets, books, you name it. Anything that you set down and didn't keep an eye on, soon after it would be gone, and then you'd have to go look. After toughing it out for nearly a year, he packed his family up and moved to a different house. The airport and all the houses are gone. I think there's a housing development there now on the land, and I often wonder if anybody that has a new house built on that old lot, if they've had any bizarre occurrences. I moved from League City to Seabrook, Texas in 1980, up until I joined the Border Patrol in 1990. I was a volunteer in the fire department. The equipment was all owned by the firefighters. The department was in existence before the town was incorporated. The house I lived in is gone. Used to sit right off of Toddville Road. Got washed away during Hurricane Alicia. There is a pizza sub shop named the Midnight Slice on Main Street. The building started out as the Seabrook Post Office. People have reported things going on that cannot be explained. Things like doors opening and closing by themselves, or a broken oven timer that will begin ringing, letting the staff know that the ghost pizza is done. Alarms go off by themselves all the time for no apparent reason. While the Midnight Slice was preparing for their grand opening, a man stopped by to chat. Ah, the joys of living in a small town. You get to know most of the people around you. The man told the staff his name was Curly. He hung around and he talked about the history of the area. Maybe a month later, one of the patrons was talking with an employee when Curly's visit was mentioned. The woman listened to the story and then said this was impossible because Curly was her great-grandfather. He had died years ago. The description of Curly, along with his love of history, sounded exactly like her long-dead great-grandfather. A woman has been known to visit the Midnight Slice, not there to order food, but to visit the spirit of her mother who is hanging out in that location. Why a ghost or several ghosts might decide to hang out at a particular location is anyone's guess. There are ghosts in locations where nobody ever died, and there are locations where hundreds died in violent altercations, and ghost hunters are hard-pressed to find anything paranormal. Case in point, the trenches from World War I. Thousands of men were killed, their bodies never recovered. And yet, ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts who frequent the area say they hardly ever find any kind of activity. Makes you wonder. Back in the 60s, men stationed at the Laredo Air Force Base were sometimes surprised to find themselves being treated by a Navy officer at the hospital. Officer Wick had been assigned to Laredo as a medical officer. Years before arriving in Laredo, he had been given a secret recipe for making pizza dough and sauce. He would make his pies at the base. The men loved his pizza so much they began calling him Wizard Wick. His pizza was that good. In 1974, the base was closed and Wizard Wick stopped serving his clientele. Laredo did have several pizza places, but there's something incredibly inviting about enjoying an independent kitchen where they make the food to a higher standard. Eric Wick stayed in Laredo, and on occasion he would break out his father's recipe and serve his families or guests. In 2015, after receiving many requests, Eric decided to open his own restaurant. A friend of his owned a house on Meadow Street, just 4 blocks south of the cemeteries. The house had sat empty for some time, and it was in need of repair, but Eric thought it just might work. There was a story going around that back many years, a man living in the house had come to the end of his rope. He decided to end it all by hanging himself in the backyard. It was October, and people driving by thought the body visible from Meadow Street was just a really elaborate Halloween decoration. It took several days before the authorities discovered it was not an effigy. The restaurant needed a name, and so Eric christened it Wizard Wicks, in honor of his father. It only took a couple of weeks before the place was a major hit. People who had grown up eating at the restaurant at the airbase flocked to enjoy a meal from the past. The parking lot is very small, barely able to hold 7 vehicles, so people park all up and down Meadow and on the side streets so they can enjoy a pizza. Some folks seem to have stayed on long after their time. On the walls of the restaurant are hundreds of pictures and old signs. There's a painting of an alien eating pizza, which has become the official image of the business. The painting had been done by a local artist at Eric's request. He hadn't planned on having aliens as such a huge part of his business, but over time, people gave him all manner of alien memorabilia. One painting, a very large work with peace signs and symbols, has been seen to jump from its place and land on the floor 10 feet away. This has happened even when the closest person was sitting 6 feet away. They say it doesn't fall to the floor. It flies off the nail, holding it, and lands on the floor. Items sitting on the shelves have been seen to jump away from the resting places and land well away from where they should have landed. One of the employees was standing at the counter preparing for the evening. Eric noticed the man looked as if something bizarre had just happened. When asked, the employee said, as he stood there, a shadow figure had leaned out from the doorway to the men's room. The shadow looked around the dining room as if searching for someone, then ducked back into the bathroom. The employee thought someone had snuck in before the place was open. The doors were all locked. He carefully moved over to the door and opened it. There was no one there. Eric had to reassure the man he wasn't crazy. Others had seen the shadow moving around the rooms of the restaurant. The shadow has been seen moving through the kitchen. As it passed a case of bottled water, the cases fell over onto the floor. In the yard to the north of the dining room is an open area with tables and a stage for live music. Bands come to Wizard Wicks to perform on the weekends. People will snap photos as they play or once the music is over. On one occasion, as the band members posed for a photo, they were joined by something odd. When the photo was being examined later that week, you could see a shadow being standing with the musicians. There's been a glowing orb seen in the dining room. It drops down from the ceiling and drifts down to the floor. It vanishes into the wood. On many occasions when Eric arrived to open up, he discovered the place was way too hot. Someone or something had turned the oven on during the night. After having this happen a few times, Eric announced from then on the gas would be turned off from outside before the staff left for the night. This has kept the mischievous ghosts from heating up the place at night. One day, Eric had brought a box filled with arrowheads to the restaurant. The walls are covered with relics from the past, and these might just make a nice addition to the decorations. Customers began coming in, so the box was placed out of the way on the sink and everybody got to work. Suddenly, the box jumped from the sink onto the floor, scattering arrowheads everywhere. The floor of the restaurant is wood. Anybody walking across the floor will make enough noise to be heard in the kitchen. Several times, people working in the kitchen have heard the distinct sound of footsteps in the dining area. They look out from the kitchen to see who is there, only to find the room is empty. A paranormal investigator brought an EMF detector to the restaurant. He asked all the usual questions. Is there someone here that wants to communicate with us, and how many spirits are here? As he asked the questions, the EMF would light up. You have to use yes and no questions. For any question dealing with numbers, you have to ask, is there one spirit, 2, 3? When the number is found, the EMF will light up. Well, this EMF lit up at 7. Eric tried to use the EMF detector, but he received no answers. His friend asked if the spirits liked Eric, yes or no, to which they got a no as the answer. A staff working in the kitchen will hear something slam on one of the tables. They say it sounds like someone took a big book and slammed it down. This happens when the dining room is empty. They also hear doors and cabinets slam shut. Some folks might find it unnerving to work or dine in a haunted restaurant. Others just take it in stride. The ghosts are seen and heard, but they seldom do anything bad other than mess the place up. If you're looking for the best pizza around and you don't mind sharing the evening with ghosts, check out Wizard Wicks, 2701 North Meadow Avenue in Laredo, Texas, just a few blocks south of the cemeteries. The location of the Magnolia Mansion started out as a log cabin that was built in 1840 by Texas Ranger James Campbell. Campbell only lived there for a year. He was involved in the peace treaties being signed, or should say being hammered out, between Texans and the Comanche. During the writing of the treaty, things went way wrong and a fight broke out. People were killed, mostly Indians. As a result, one day while traveling to San Antonio, Campbell was attacked by the Indians, and they really messed him up. They left lots of holes in his body and removed his hair. The property was then used as a stagecoach station with a few rooms for guests to stay the night. The building had a basement that was used to hold prisoners waiting to either be transported to San Antonio or hung, depending. Being the only big building in Seguin, whenever there was a funeral, the viewing would be held in the cabin. The small log cabin soon became a much bigger structure. Rooms were added, as well as an upper floor. It became a hotel in 1844, a year before Texas became a state. Seguin was named in honor of Juan Seguin, a Tejano Texan freedom fighter and early supporter of the Republic of Texas. It is one of the oldest towns in Texas, founded just 16 months after the Texas Revolution began. Did you see the movie The Alamo, the one with Dennis Quaid playing Sam Houston? Jordi Mola played Juan Seguin. He was the guy they sent to convince the politicians to send troops to the Alamo. In the movie, he tells the Hispanic soldiers in the Texas Army to put playing cards in the brim of their hats so the others would know they were on their side. Yes, this really happened. Few of the Texas soldiers had uniforms. Some of the Mexican soldiers were caught half undressed. Confusion could lead to the wrong people being shot. When Santa Anna surrendered, Seguin returned to the Alamo to try finding his unit so they could receive a proper burial. Alexander Harris was a successful cotton merchant. He purchased the property from a man named Rufus McIlhenny in 1857. The hotel was given a huge makeover, turning it into a mansion by its new owner. This was a gift for his bride, Elizabeth Johnson. He had the old stagecoach station rebuilt in a Greek Revival style. Elizabeth, or Lizzie as she was known, was quite young at the time, as in too young to be getting married, but they did things like that back then. The renovations took 2 years before the house was ready for the Harris family to move in. The building was overly aggrandized to show off how much money Alexander had. In the summer of 1869, just 11 years after the Harrises moved in, Alexander Harris fell victim to the yellow fever. Yellow fever is a serious, potentially deadly flu-like disease that is spread by mosquitoes. It's characterized by high fever and jaundice. And jaundice is a yellowing of the skin and eyes, which is why this disease is called yellow fever. 1853 outbreak claimed 7,849 residents in New Orleans. The press and the medical profession did not alert citizens of the outbreak until the middle of July, after more than 1,000 people had already died. The New Orleans business community feared that word of an epidemic would cause a quarantine be placed on the city, and this might affect their profits. The 1867 yellow fever epidemic claimed many casualties in southern counties of Texas as well as New Orleans. Another victim in 1869 was Alexander's own brother, Aaron Harris, who died at his home at 35 Bourbon Street in New Orleans. The two brothers died less than 24 hours apart. Their funerals were held on the same day, July 20th, 1869, at both of the brothers' homes. Back in those days, funerals were held in the parlor of a home. The funeral director would rent out all the proper funeral gear, things like the viewing table and the clothes that everyone was expected to wear. The fancier houses had what was known as a false door. The door was only used to carry the deceased from the house after the funeral. With the creation of funeral homes, the parlor became known as the living room. The aftermath of the Harris brothers' deaths resulted in an even more bizarre turn of events. Lizzie, Alexander's widow, wanted to ensure that her sister-in-law, Henriette, received nothing of the Harris family fortune. She sued Henriette for the sum of $8,400 that was allegedly owed to Alexander by Aaron Harris sometime before his death. Henriette had nothing, her husband having been worth very little when he died of yellow fever, and she was forced to convert her home at 35 Bourbon Street into a boarding house in order to support her 5 children. That, too, was not enough, and shortly after, Henriette lost her family home. Some folks are just plain nasty. To treat your family this way is just short of evil. Here's something to think about. After the Titanic sunk and hundreds of people lost their lives, the White Star Line sent bills to the families for the uniforms their dads and sons had been wearing when the ship went down. You see, they rented their uniforms, and since the uniforms went down with the ship, the families were expected to pay for them. Whatever became of Henriette and her kids is lost to history. Lizzie remarried a guy named Cornell Burke in 1871. Not wanting to live in the mansion Alexander had built for her, Lizzie moved out and put the property up for sale. While it sat on the market, people were allowed to rent rooms there. One of these was William Faust. Faust was a druggist. His work took him on the road a lot. While Faust was on the road, his wife didn't want to stay alone at the hotel, so she would stay with friends in New Braunfels, 15 miles northwest. Faust became enamored with his sister-in-law, and he decided that he was going to kill his wife and then get a new one. He arrived at the hotel and made a show of being there. Late that night, he snuck away and headed to New Braunfels. Once there, Faust slipped into the house, made his way to the room his wife was sleeping in, carrying an axe. There, he killed a 12-year-old girl, Emma Volker, who was sharing the room with his wife. Realizing he'd attacked the wrong person, Faust tried to kill his wife as well, but she was able to survive despite being seriously injured. Faust left New Braunfels and went back to the hotel, thinking he was now free to go after his sister-in-law. Authorities soon became suspicious of Faust when he wasn't overly concerned when he found out that a young girl had been murdered and his wife was seriously injured. He acted as if this was nothing. This caused the sheriff to look closely at Faust and eventually arrest him. Faust was given life sentence. The locals thought that justice wasn't being served, so they descended on the jail with intentions of seeing to it that Faust met his maker. The deputies did their duty trying to protect the murderer, but during the scuffle somebody leaned in through a window and shot Faust, killing him. The jail was underneath the hotel. As I was putting my show notes together, I was looking for anything to do with the Magnolia Mansion. What I didn't know is there's also a Magnolia Mansion in New Orleans that seems to be somehow connected to the one in Seguin. Since they're both haunted, I wound up reading and writing a bunch of cool stories, only to discover I was in the wrong city. I was trying to keep all my stories tonight on things that happened in Texas. I had to scrap a bunch of notes and start all over. I really hate it when that happens, but maybe I'll do something about New Orleans later. The mansion in Seguin was bought and sold several times from the day it was first erected. In the early 1900s, the building was subdivided into apartments. As time marched by, the building began to slowly fall into disrepair. By the 1950s, the place was no longer considered a hotel. It was a flophouse, frequented by drunks, prostitutes, and drug addicts. People would go there when they had no place else to go. The rooms were no longer being rented, and folks would sneak in through a window and do their nasty deeds there, hopefully where nobody would see them. The place became a crack house for a spell. Some of the people staying there couldn't face life anymore, and so they chose to end their lives long before its time. I like old buildings. They have a soul. You just don't find in modern structures. I'm not alone in these thoughts. There are lots of people who will see an old falling down building and want to save it. The property was purchased in 2013 by Jim and Erin Getty. They began the process of bringing the hotel back to its former glory. By 2019, the mansion was once more turned into a hotel. Sort of. The Seguin Mansion is only available to a few guests at a time, and once you're there, you're kind of on your own. They only allow 4 guests at a time, and you get a suite instead of just a room. The suite has a living room, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a bathroom. Then you can walk around looking for dead folks. With so much tragedy having occurred on this location, it should be no surprise that Magnolia Mansion is considered one of the most haunted places in Seguin. Okay, here we go again. The most haunted place in an area. I still think people should use the star system. A 1-star haunting is like the Haunted Mansion at Disney World. A 5-star haunting, well, that would be some place where you're guaranteed to see a ghost and maybe get your face slapped. The ghosts that hang out at the Magnolia aren't considered to be scary. The owner says they're all quite friendly, except for the one in room 3. That's where Faust was staying the night he killed Emma. One of the ghosts you might encounter is that of a young woman who was staying at the stagecoach station waiting for her fiancé. As each coach would arrive, she would look for the man of her dreams. The whole time she was there, she refused to eat or drink, as each day drug into a week, then several. The woman died from a lack of food and water. Her ghost is felt in the ballroom. As she passes by, you can feel her dress brush against you. There's a photograph showing the front of the hotel. In it, you can see a woman looking out the front window. Her image is kind of translucent, but it looks just like a person waiting for someone. One of the folks taking the tour took a photograph of one of the pictures hanging in the ballroom. The image is behind glass and it's kind of reflective. In the glass, you can see a woman looking over the man's shoulder, reflected back at you. Once again, you can kind of see through her as you look. Just about everybody visiting the Magnolia has some kind of an encounter. Spirits show up in lots of photos taken throughout the building. In another photo taken from outside, you can see a woman and 2 kids looking out the window of the kitchen. Inside the room, there's a table with appliances on it where the 3 would have been standing had they been alive. Of all the ghosts at the hotel, the oddest one is Emma, the little girl who was murdered in New Braunfels. Somehow, not only did she travel 15 miles to her new haunt, she is credited with having the new owners find the hotel in the first place. Jim and Erin lived in New Braunfels. Erin was in the process of writing a book on the town, and she was told that she would say something about the axe murder from 1874. Her research led Erin and her husband to drive to Seguin just to take some photos of the falling down building. That was when they decided to buy the place and restore it. Shortly after they began, the ghost of Emma made her presence known. I wonder, is she there to keep Faust locked in his room, or is she there to antagonize him? The strongest spirit in the magnolia is that of Adela Lambkin. Adela was a fortune teller back in the day. She became so popular people would line up out front of her home waiting for readings. Finally, she moved her practice to the hotel so she would have more room. She read fortunes in the hotel for years. After her death, Adele tends to pull her descendants to the hotel. People will show up with no idea why. They say they felt drawn to the building. Aaron will ask if they had an ancestor named Adele, and they would usually say yes. It's kind of like she wants to see her relatives there. The mansion has been visited by a few ghost hunting groups. Taps on Ghost Nation did an investigation, as well as the Ghost Brothers, Ghost Adventures, When Ghosts Attack, Paranormal Caught on Camera, as well as a few more. The mansion is very photogenic, and the owners are willing to allow investigations. The rooms in the mansion have been named depending on their history. One room is called the Pink Bathroom, where a woman chose to end her life. There's the John Doe Room, named for a man who died there who no one knew his name. His remains were buried in the city cemetery, simply listed as John Doe. There's the Prisoner's Room. The families of those condemned to hang would stay in one of the rooms of the hotel. The deputies would transport the accused past the room's balcony so the next of kin could say their goodbyes. This room has an overpowering feeling of sadness. You can find the haunted Magnolia Mansion at 203 South Crockett Street in Seguin, Texas. Now, before I forget, I want to mention a few of my friends who have businesses who could use the money. This time, it's not a bad idea to support local businesses or small businesses. The Organic Man Coffee Trike at 4501 McPherson. They have the best coffee on the planet. If you're not in Laredo, you can get coffee from them by going to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Optica del Norte at 107 Calle del Norte. You should be able to see what you're looking at. If your skin looks like you've been rubbing it with sandpaper, maybe you should get a free skincare consultation. Contact Lourdes James at 956-723-3019 and get a free skincare class. And if you've got something hanging out in your house and you think it just might be the spirit of a long-dead ancestor, contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com and have them come by and see if maybe you live in a haunted house or not. The original battle cry was, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." Unfortunately, some folks have forgotten Goliad. Near the south bank of the San Antonio River, a fortress stands out against the local backdrop of trees and blue sky. Through 2 revolutions, countless skirmishes, and untold hours of everyday life, Presidio La Bahia has stood on this spot since 1749. A presidio was a fortified base established by the Spanish in areas under their control or influence. The term is derived from the Latin word presidium, meaning protection or defense. La Bahia holds centuries of history both on its grounds and beneath them, in forms ranging from monuments in honor of its heroes to mass graves of the unknown departed. Although the cannon on its parapets have long fallen silent, many believe that hundreds of souls that left this plane of existence on the grounds of La Bahia have left behind a goodly number of unquiet stragglers. That's all from their website. What is our life force made up of? We are all energy, and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be changed. When a person dies, what becomes of that energy? The Presidio La Bahia was originally established as a Spanish stronghold to defend Spain's mining interests in the area. After French colonists withdrew from the Texas territory, the fort became a waypoint along a major trade route and a gateway to the river. At first a show of military might, it soon became a vital landmark of the region. If you're traveling through the area, you would find the Presidio, and that's where you would stay for the night. If you needed food or water, well, that's where you would get it. It was kind of like an inn on the way from one place to another. As the fort transformed into an economic hub, the town of Goliad sprouted and blossomed around it. The fort chapel, Our Lady of Loreto, was constructed to serve the soldiers, their families, and then the townfolk. Being the only consecrated ground for miles in any direction, the chapel courtyard soon became home to hundreds of graves, some marked and some unmarked. What with all the war going on in the area, there was a lot of bloodshed in that part of the country. Civilian life persisted around the fort even as it changed hands from Spain, then to Mexico. When Mexico decided to break away from Spain, Presidio La Bahia changed hands many times. An outpost was only capable of surviving as long as they were receiving support from the rear. A bunch of soldiers can only last as long as there is food, water, and words of encouragement to hold out. As soon as the troops begin to think their commanders no longer value them, they will start looking for support elsewhere, maybe from the other side. This has happened many times in this area. During the Texas Revolution, Presidio La Bahia was commanded by Colonel James Fannin of the Texas Army. He renamed it Fort Defiance. When they were running critically low on supplies, they had some very bad storms, and they were no longer able to support the Alamo, Fannin was ordered to abandon the fort and fall back to Victoria. Fannin had started out to reinforce the Alamo, but then they went back to La Bahia. He then tried to retreat to Victoria, only to once more return to Bahia. When General Jose de Oria demanded the Texas surrender, Fannin thought, well, this might be a good idea. General Santa Anna had a very bad reputation. He was not the kind of guy you wanted to surrender to. The term, give no quarter, was one of his favorites. No one was spared at the Alamo, and this was to be repeated at Goliad. General Urrea convinced the defenders to surrender, and they would be marched to Mexico City to sit out the remainder of the war. When Urrea refused a presidential order to execute the prisoners as pirates, his lieutenant took up the order and had Fannin and his men divided up into small groups to be killed. The next day the men were broken up into smaller groups, marched away from the fort. Once they were a ways from the walls, the Mexican soldiers shot some, bayoneted others, or simply beat them to death. Churchill said it best, "Never, never, never surrender." Jason Nesmith said, "Never give up, never surrender." 445 soldiers of the Texas Army were killed on the roads around the fort. The wounded, who couldn't walk, were shot inside the fort. To this day, the chapel of Our Lady of Lorento remains a functioning church, holding weekly services and, on occasion, weddings. The structure has stood unchanged since 1779, but the past can be seen everywhere. As a center of activity in peacetime as well as war, the chapel is rumored to be home to a dense and varied population of spirits. You can hear the sounds of babies crying. There's a church organ that you can hear on occasion, and a woman's choir can sometimes be heard from outside. The bell has been known to chime at all times of the night and day for no apparent reason. A woman in mourning attire is said to appear at the offering table to light a candle, while another woman in white wanders the courtyard as if searching for a grave, looking for the name of somebody that she can't find. They also see a robed prior patrolling the grounds outside. Near the chapel, a section of the officers' quarters can be rented for the night by parties of 4 or fewer. One should do so with caution, for the abnormal activity is known to occur. The most common manifestation in the quarters are phantom footsteps, distant cannon fire, banging on the walls, and the sound of a woman humming cheerfully outside. This is also where the presence of Fanon himself is mostly felt. Some overnight guests have experienced a sharp pain in their leg. Fanon had been wounded in the leg. They will have attacks of panic and dread, echoing his final moments. Though some have claimed a feeling of hostility from his presence, anger at the untimely demise and the loss of his men. A general feeling of mournfulness is described. Fanon was the last to be killed. He requested not to be shot in the face, to have a Christian burial, and that his personal possessions be sent to his family. He was shot in the head, his body was dumped in a pile and burned, and his possessions were taken by the men who killed him. On the other side of the chapel's courtyard wall is the quadrangle where the injured among Fanon's men were executed. Vultures still flock to this area in abnormal numbers. Perhaps they're attracted to some lingering impression of the massacre that some visitors still sense. On occasion, people have smelled what they described as blood in the area. Aggressive poltergeist-like echoes of Uria's men are said to bark orders in Spanish and attempt to shove the unwary living to their knees. At sunset, some have seen bodies laying on the ground out of the corner of their eye, or caught a whiff of burnt, rotten flesh. My wife and I stopped off at the Presidio on one of our many trips. I didn't feel anything out of the ordinary, but then I seldom do. My wife was a bit uneasy the whole time we were there. Whether you encounter a ghost on your own visit to Presidio La Bahia or not, this is a very nice place to visit. Lots of history there. Some history is not so violent, some is. Thousands of people visit the Alamo every year. Not so many go to Goliad to remember their dead. Maybe it's because most of the men who died at the Alamo died fighting, while most of those at La Bahia were killed after they surrendered. Francita Alavez was a common-law wife of one of Uria's officers. She argued passionately for mercy for the prisoners, and was fortunate enough to have some luck in this venture. She succeeded in having 20 men spared for their medical, linguistic, or other useful knowledge, and managed to hide an unknown number of others, saving their lives. For this and her humanitarian efforts throughout the war, Alavez became known as the Angel of Goliad, in time earning a statue that now stands in her honor in the Presidios Plaza. I can't talk about the Presidio at Goliad without talking about the Alamo as well. December 15, 1835, President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna threw out the Constitution of Mexico and tried to consolidate all the power into Mexico City. Many states didn't much care for this and tried to break free. Northern Coahuila, aka Texas, was the most successful. The folks living in Gonzales had been loaned a cannon to protect their town from bandits and hostile Indians. When the Mexican army showed up and tried to take it back, they were met with the saying, "Come and take it." The people in Gonzales then proceeded to chase the Mexican army all the way to the Rio Grande. By the end of the year, a group of Texan volunteer soldiers had occupied the Alamo, a former Franciscan mission located near the present-day city of San Antonio. They had been ordered to destroy the cannon found in the garrison. Travis thought the place was worth defending, and he was convinced that Santa Anna would not try to march north in the middle of the winter. Well, the Santa Anna was pissed, and he rounded up every man in prison, added them to his army, and then started north. It is said he started out with well over 6,000 men, but he arrived in Texas with only 4,500. The trail was a mess, and a lot of men died from the cold, lack of proper gear, lack of edible food, and sickness. Priests accompanying the army worked full-time just burying the dead. Between Mexico City and San Antonio are hundreds of unmarked graves. Santa Anna split his army in half, sending some to Goliad, while the rest headed to the Alamo. The Alamo was designed to defend against bandits and hostile Indians. No one had ever thought it would be used as an actual fort. By mid-February 1836, Colonel James Bowie and Lieutenant Colonel William B. Travis had taken command of the Texas forces in San Antonio. Sam Houston, the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Texas forces, argued that San Antonio should be abandoned due to the insufficient number of troops. The Alamo defenders, led by Bowie and Travis, dug in nonetheless, prepared to defend the fort to the last. These defenders, who despite their later reinforcements never numbered more than 200, including Davy Crockett, the former congressman from Tennessee who had arrived in early February. The walls around the Alamo were 1,320 feet around. There were only 200 men to defend it. That meant each man had 6 feet of wall all to himself. Not every man was a shooter. There were men who fired their rifles, and there were men, usually young boys, who loaded and handed the rifles forward. A part of the wall was so thick the defenders on top couldn't see Mexican soldiers at the bottom of the other side. Just so you'll know, in all the movies of the Alamo, the directors always make the area much smaller, as in 30%, so that the defenders are closer together. It looks better on film. Santa Anna had told Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, that the rebellious men in Texas were to be treated as pirates. At the time, pirates were executed as soon as they were captured. Andrew Jackson didn't bother to forward this information to the people in Texas. This may have been why so many of the Texans tried to surrender, only to be killed. The Alamo fell March 6th, and 200 defenders were all either killed in the fight or shot or stabbed to death after. Goliad was 3 weeks later, where over 400 men were killed. April 21st, 1836, Sam Houston and 800 Texans defeated Santa Anna's Mexican army of 1,500 men at the San Jacinto battlegrounds, right next to where the battleship Texas sits today. The men were shouting, "Remember the Alamo." See, they already forgot. No, they were yelling, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," as they attacked. The victory ensured the success of Texas independence. Santa Anna, who was taken prisoner, came to terms with Houston to end the war. In May, Mexican troops in San Antonio were ordered to withdraw, and they were told to demolish the Alamo's fortifications as they left. Unfortunately, Houston claimed all of the land north of the Rio Grande as Texas. Santa Anna and Mexico called it the Rio Bravo. The Rio Grande was the Nueces River. This led to a whole new set of problems that had to be solved using rifles and swords. Today, folks visiting the Alamo will only see a very small part of it. Most of the extensive walls that had been defended are gone. There are businesses where many of the men died. Spotted in the gardens next to the mission appears the fully formed spirit of a cowboy, complete with a black duster and a cowboy hat. He's dripping wet, and he's described as looking like he's ridden through a severe thunderstorm. Many Texas historians theorize that the spirit may have been one of the 22 dispatch riders that William Travis had sent out seeking assistance. A second entity that makes its presence known is that of one of the Alamo defenders, who is often reported to stick his head and shoulders out of the large rectangular window over the double doors at the front of the church. After leaning out and scoping out the area, he will lean back in and disappear. In 1836, the chapel didn't have a roof, only a second floor. That's where that window is. When the folks think about the Alamo, they always envision the old chapel with that curved facade right over the front doors. That curved piece of architecture, the campanulette, wasn't added until 1845. The land where the battle took place was to be used by the military. The Army requisitioned the old church as a storehouse, and it needed a roof to protect the goods inside. The cheapest way of doing this was a pitched roof, and the best way to hide the pitched roof was to put up the gable in front. The Army had that iconic facade put on the Alamo. A woman is seen next to the water well on the other side of the church. She appears at night. She materializes as a vaporous torso-like spirit. Some of the defenders had their families with them. Nobody was expecting Santa Anna to show up when he did. They have seen a tall, stately Mexican officer wandering the grounds and buildings of the historic site. He has a look of sorrow on his face. The man is seen walking with his arms clasped behind his back, and he's shaking his head as he goes. Many believe the ghostly man is that of General Manuel Fernandez de Castrillon, get it right one of these days, Castrillon, one of Santa Anna's regimental commanders. Castrillon was one of the few officers who had opposed the final assault on the Alamo, stating that it was going to be a bloodbath. People have reported seeing an Indian in the building used by staff members as offices. They see him turn and walk through a wall where at one time there had been a tunnel that ran out to where the Menger Hotel sits today. In March of every year, a few days after the final demise of the Alamo, numerous people report hearing the sound of horses galloping on the pavement early in the morning. Many believe the unseen rider is James Allen, who was the last courier to leave the Alamo on the evening before the final battle. He is heard wandering through the streets around where the walls used to be, like he's attempting to return to the Alamo with his report for Colonel Travis. The spirits of two small boys have been seen following tour groups on the property. They will appear behind the group and then quickly vanish when the group reaches the sacristy room. People believe them to be the sons of Alamo artilleryman Anthony Wolfe. The boys aged 9 and 12 were killed during the final assault when they were mistaken for Texas soldiers. Guides tell visitors that nearly every storefront building on the Alamo Plaza, which faces the church, are all haunted. Built directly over where the old compound walls used to be, the spirits of those who died defending the compound are said to roam the area. A bookstore located beneath the bridge experiences ghostly activity, including one corner of the store that stays cold all the time. Books frequently fly off the shelves on their own. This is one of the locations where the defenders' bodies were burned. The bodies of the Mexican soldiers were taken to a spot that today is a children's park across from Market Square, nearly a mile from the Alamo. The park is haunted by the spirits of the soldiers who died in a distant land, fighting for a general that they didn't much care for. So there you have it, just a few stories from around Texas of ghosts and weird activity. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, let your friends know what they're missing. If you have any ideas for subjects you'd like to hear about, you can contact me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Let me know what you'd like to hear, and I'll see if I can turn it into a show. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?